Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 11th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen more than 11,000 deaths due to the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, America shooting down a giant Chinese balloon it believed was spying on key military sites, and Beyoncé with her 32nd trophy breaking the record for winning the most Grammys ever. You can read more about all of that in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today is book reviews editor for the International Affairs Journal, Mariana Vieira, writer and comedian Suchandrika Chakrabarti, and we welcome back YouTube director for Auto Trader, Rory Reid. And Rory, I got very excited on Saturday night. I don't know if you know, but you were an answer on Ant and Dec's Limitless Win.
My phone went crazy that night because my friend wanted to know if I knew the answer and I got it wrong.
So the question was, I think, how many presenters of Top Gear have there been since its relaunch in 2002? Do you now know?
The correct answer, I think, is 12 now.
Oh, 12. There we go. 12.
But I guessed 11.
It's a delight to be joined by 1/12 of an answer from Limitless Win.
Yes.
You're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are the chips down for China?
Today's automobiles need 3,000 chips, each of those automobiles. But American automobiles couldn't make enough cars because there weren't enough chips. Car prices went up, people got laid off. So did everything from refrigerators to cell phones. We can never let that happen again. That's why we came together to pass the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act.
Standing ovation there for President Biden delivering his State of the Union address on Wednesday. You wouldn't necessarily expect people to be on their feet about microchips, Rory. Why were they?
Well, they're very important because essentially, I think America, the United States, and the rest of the big players in the world consider any nation that has an advantage in the world of semiconductors, aka chips, to be arguably the most powerful or well-equipped to become the most powerful. And the US has always had an advantage in the world of semiconductors. They used to design, manufacture, and assemble them all on US soil. But by the late 60s, they realized that they could make a lot more money by selling chips for civilian use, stuff for computers, stuff that we use in our phones right now. But in order to do that, they needed to make loads and to make them cheap. So a lot of the US chip companies moved their assembly and manufacturing facilities to countries like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and Hong Kong because of cheap labor. And at the time, the US banned these chip companies from sharing technology with the USSR and China because they wanted to protect their advantage and to always have the most powerful chips.
Yes. And then as relationships with China improved, China was then sharing a lot more of that data, right?
Yeah, definitely. So after the Cold War was over, China became more friendly with the USA and the US lifted many of their export controls. China then began to entice many of the chip companies that the US effectively empowered to move some of their operations into China. But China wanted more. And for years, they've been accused of intellectual property theft, effectively stealing or copying some of the high-end methods used by the US for advanced military-grade chips. And China have started to catch up.
And so that's what's behind this Chips and Science Act that the president was talking about. What's that attempting to do?
Basically, they're pumping billions of dollars into this Chips and Science Act in order to gain back control, not just for the design, but for the manufacture of these chips as well, and have that all on American soil, because one of the things that they've actually done now is to tell all these chip companies, look, you need to stop dealing with China and only deal with us. And they've done a big deal with Taiwan's biggest chip making company to build and manufacture plants in the US. Taiwan is a very, very interesting place. they actually manufacture 60% of all chips in the world and 92% of all advanced chips, which is what all these governments want to get their hands on. And with the US's new export controls in place, they've effectively forced Taiwan and other places in that region to make a decision, defy the US and keep selling to China, or to cut China off. And that's where we're ending up right now. It seems Taiwan is likely to cut off China, and that's going to spark another Cold War in the world of chips.
Yes. So, Chandrika, this suddenly puts the US's support of Taiwan into a context that makes a lot more sense, perhaps, than people otherwise understood.
The business in Taiwan is not just about making chips for their own economy or their own market. It's about having licenses from other countries and making chips on their behalf. And so that's why Taiwan has been so important for America, because they've been doing the production on their behalf. But the issue is that Taiwan is so close to China geographically and otherwise. And so if the US is trying to stop China getting in on this market, they need to have a closer eye on Taiwan and maybe redefine their relationship with the production in Taiwan.
Because, Mariana, everyone's been showing support for the Taiwanese recently, seemingly. This week it was the Swiss.
I love that this is no longer my conspiracy theory from last time I was on the podcast, that we had the German lawmakers and the Lithuanian lawmakers visit Taiwan. And yes, this week we have the Swiss lawmakers visiting Taiwan as well. And I think something that's really important about the US's initiative to move, or to try to get the assembly lines back into the US soil, is that it's something that Chris Miller in his Chip War book mentions, which is the difficulty of actually moving all these factories. Like, Taiwan is extremely important because it's difficult to replicate the chip making facilities, because you would need to have to move all this training personnel. You need all the and the machinery actually requires the production, like the machinery requires the semiconductors themselves. So it's all this very complicated process with lots of, pun unintended, but lots of chips and lots of pieces falling into place. And Taiwan becomes also more important, not only because it is near China, but because China has this one China policy that all these other countries, especially in the West, have been very supportive of, or at least have not opposed to, except Lithuania, who has been very vocal about it.
And Rory, you used the phrase Cold War. Is that a little inflammatory? And are microchips as important to the economy as the other kinds of things people usually have Cold Wars over, like oil?
I think it's arguably more important. I think people underestimate the importance of microchips. Just look at what happened during COVID, when the world effectively started working from home and everybody needed more chips. We needed our laptops and iPads and chips in our cars. And because there weren't enough going round, it affected the cost of pretty much everything out there and slowed down the production of pretty much everything that needed a microchip. There was a big shortage of PlayStations, of vehicles, and all this stuff. But the chips that the big countries want are all the military grade stuff. So during the first Cold War, it was the chips that allowed America to track submarines and to actually develop the more advanced weapon systems that gave them such a competitive advantage in the battlefield. And I think that is what America really, really want to keep hands on for themselves.
So yeah, you can see just in the market share how things have changed for the US. So back in 1990, the US had a 37% market share of semiconductor production. And today that share has fallen to about 12%. Basically, Biden said we're making sure that the supply chain for America begins in America. So it's clearly a case of, if we keep things offshore, we can't be definite that we will have the chips that we need. And so let's bring it back onto American soil as much as possible.
Do you guys understand the scale of how difficult it is to manufacture these chips? So they manufacture chips based on nanometer manufacturing techniques. A nanometer is a unit of measurement, and it dictates the size of the transistors, these little switches that you can squeeze onto a chip. 1 nanometer is a millionth of a millimeter, or 1/1,000,000th the thickness of the lead in a pencil tip. And to put that into perspective, China, I think they're currently on 7 nanometer chips, which is pretty good. But they first came about in around 2018. So they're about 5 or 6 years behind the current state of the art. The US now has access to 3 nanometer chips, very tiny, and will shortly be using 2 nanometer chips, which means all their chips using these techniques are way faster than what the Chinese have access to. And that is what America want to protect. And that is what China want a piece of. So there's going to be an interesting battle over the next few years as we see China and the US go head to head to try and gain a competitive advantage.
Mariana.
I find it really interesting that it's like this tech race or this tech war going on. But actually, the way that the other video that we were looking at about, so the headline was, "Why is China losing the chip war?" I kind of feel like maybe this US incentive or push to bring everything back into the US soil is actually going to put China in a much more dangerous position where, well, if we can get these chips anywhere else and Taiwan is right here, then there's perhaps a bigger incentive to push back on this or remind everyone about their one China policy. I just feel like it's sort of leaving China with very little other options. So you might win the race or the tech war, but the politics of it are sort of going to be much more uncertain, much more volatile.
But the supply chains are so global. That's the thing, Mariana. I mean, the companies that are out in Asia making chips for phones are making them for American companies often, right? So that's complicated, isn't it? If iPhone relies on Taiwan and China, if iPhone relies on Taiwan and China, then it's not clear exactly what would happen. Even if the chips are being made in America, the assembly of the phone is happening in China.
Yeah, but there's two things to that. One is that the US is trying to bring all the design, manufacture, and assembly back to the US, so everything would move there. So they would sort of simplify the process in a way. But the other thing is that part of the Chips and Science Act is that the investments are conditional on all these other companies not doing business with China, which again isolates China and puts it again in a position where if it can't find the chips that it needs in the market, because China currently buys or spends more money on chips than it actually does on oil, then where are they going to find them? They're not suddenly going to stop using them, and they're not going to suddenly stop needing them. So it feels like maybe it's not the whole story.
And in your predominant area, Rory, cars, how is this impacting?
It could be huge. So at the moment, China have an enormous, I don't know if I want to use the word stranglehold, but a massive grip on battery technology. And as we've discussed ad nauseum in the world of cars, by 2030 in the EU, there will be no new cars built using traditional internal combustion engines. Everything will be battery powered. Most of that is going to be coming from China. So if there's this huge trade war between the United States and China, and the rest of the West is implicated in that, China could fight back and say, listen, we can't have access to the latest chip technology. So where are you going to get your battery technology from for all your electric cars? This has massive implications that could run. And I don't think it's a matter that's going to be resolved very simply or very quickly.
And incidentally, Mariana, why is seemingly no one in Europe grasping this? I mean, it's all very well for the US and China to be fighting over it, but, why isn't Britain or France or Germany saying we should be a microchip superpower if it's so important?
That's a really good question. I think, as we mentioned before, the technology is really hard to replicate and to sort of move these assembly lines elsewhere. And again, I think the US would probably be unwilling to not have it in its soil if it's moving it at all. And on the other hand, Europe is quite comfortable with their strong relationship with the US, and so this sort of rivalry with China doesn't really put their supply at risk as much, and they will be in a stronger position if the US gets their way either way.
Okay. Mariana, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Mariana, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Does Pope Francis have a hidden agenda for South Sudan?
Dramatic gestures are to kick open doors, to create momentum. They don't solve problems. What they do is they may unstick stuck situations, and then they have to be followed up.
Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, speaking to BBC News on Sunday. So, Mariana, you mentioned the Pope, and we've heard from the Archbishop as well. What's the story?
On Monday, Pope Francis called for churches around the world to welcome gay folks and declared that laws criminalizing homosexuality are unjust. The Pope made these remarks during an unprecedented airborne conference as he returned from a visit to Africa that included a 3-day trip to South Sudan. This is a country where same-sex sexual relations are illegal and punishable with a prison sentence of up to 14 years.
Okay, before we get into the issue, why was it an airborne news conference? What's that?
Apparently, there were a lot of journalists on board of the Popol plane as they were returning from this trip to Africa. And they were asking the Pope several different questions. And I think it sort of turned very organically into a conference.
Okay, so it's not that by being on a plane you're somehow closer to God. I thought that might be part of the reason. I suppose the other justification for an airborne news conference, Suchandrika, might be that you're talking about a country when you're on your way out of there. And, here's the Pope clearly making reference to South Sudan and saying a thing he didn't say when he was down on the ground.
Yes, I suppose that is the way to do it. So on the plane flying out, you had Pope Francis and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the Church of Scotland all together in one place, which I don't think happens that often. And they're all backing up the same point, which is that LGBTQ plus people need to be treated differently. And the Pope said people with quote unquote homosexual tendencies are children of God and should be welcomed by the churches. To have all these three major religious leaders in one place all agreeing with each other is not something you have every day. And just to add that Pope Francis' remarks come ahead of a trip elsewhere in Africa, where these laws that he's talking about are common. Many date from British colonial times or inspired by Islamic law. And so the Catholic bishops have strongly upheld these laws in line with Vatican teaching. So it is a real move away from that line for the Pope to be saying such things.
Yeah, it's kind of a move away, Rory, but he's still not saying, the Pope, that it isn't a sin, homosexuality, is he? He's saying it isn't a crime, although actually it is a crime in South Sudan, and it is a crime in lots of countries that base their laws on the teachings of the church because it's a sin. And he's not saying it isn't a sin because it is a sin in the Bible. It's very difficult for him to really say anything other than what he said. But how much progress are you going to get whilst it's still a sin?
It's very, very confusing, isn't it? And also, I don't know, I'm not a massive expert in this, but I get very confused when I see a person saying homosexuality is not a crime, but it is a sin. And I don't know what that means. I don't know whether to take that as progress in terms of them trying to be more progressive and welcoming and wanting better rights and a better living situation for LGBTQ community, or whether it's completely hypocritical, because on the flip side, they don't allow marriage among the gay community because they say it's a sin. Now, how can you have one set of laws within your own organization and say we are going to discriminate against this group of people because it's a sin, but then tell a country not to have another set of laws which discriminate against the same group of people at the same time? For me, it's just extremely confusing, and I don't really know where it's headed. I don't know whether to say, okay, that's progress, or to say we're getting nowhere at all.
Well, perhaps the Pope was only able to venture into this territory at all, Mariana, albeit on his way out of there, because the trip down there had gone so well. I mean, the three church leaders weren't there to talk about homosexuality, were they? They were there to try and encourage peace amongst the tribal conflict that's been raging in South Sudan since 2011.
I mean, absolutely. And it's also worth mentioning that on the plane, so the Pope was asked about comments that he had made previously to the Associated Press. And he did not say that it wasn't a crime, precisely not to upset sort of the progress that had been done in South Sudan. He just said that it was unjust this time around. And yes, when they were on the ground, it was such a good example of how religious leaders can provide an alternative diplomatic route when the warring parties have failed to reconcile. And they were there specifically this time around to push for the implementation of the 2018 peace agreement, which has been agreed to, but has not really taken hold. And this builds on the visit from the South Sudanese leaders in 2019 to the Vatican, where the Pope actually got on his knees and kissed the feet of the two South Sudanese leaders who were visiting, which was not necessarily unprecedented, but a very rare gesture to sort of urge them towards peace. And it takes even more significance because of the role that the church has played in South Sudan specifically. They have a very powerful role in setting the moral limits of lethal authority. And throughout the decades, they have been involved in the different peace agreements that have been settled from the country pushed to independence, then its civil war, and now the most recent peace agreement.
So can you just talk me through that? Because South Sudan became independent in 2011. But it's not it's not officially split down religious lines, is it? But the leaders of all the factious groups, as I understand it, are all different denominations of Christian, right? So there's Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian. So it's important what the churches say with regards to wars.
Yeah, absolutely. So the country is between 40 to 60% Christian. So that's already like a very big role that the church plays there. But also it has to do with when the independence movement sort of emerged, and especially the South Sudan's People Army in 1983 emerged. They framed the conflict in terms of a pro-religion, pro-Christian SPLA versus an Islamic Sudan government. And so they were united because they had this sort of outside common enemy until they were fighting for independence. And then, as you were saying, a lot of strife has come about in terms of the disagreements within the ruling elites and the diversity of ethnic groups within the country.
I mean, it shows the power, doesn't it, Suchandrika, of these different religious groups working together. I mean, it's maybe something you're sort of used to in the UK, is that not just Christian groups, but interfaith groups regularly talk and have meetings and stuff, but obviously not in countries like South Sudan.
Yes, I agree. I think we kind of expect a kind of multi-faith attempt at agreement, at least more in the UK. But this is actually the first time that the leaders of these three religions have actually come together for a journey in 500 years. So it is a huge deal. But I will say they still have their differences. So it makes it very interesting. They're working together. And it does make you wonder what will happen down the line. So recently, the Church of England decided to allow blessings for same-sex civil marriages, but said that same-sex couples can't marry in its churches, whereas the Vatican still forbids gay marriage and blessings for same-sex unions. Now, that is a big difference.
But it's not as if the Church of England hasn't contorted itself into knots to get there.
Sure. And it's a very interesting question to see whether the Pope and the Vatican will do the same, or whether they'll continue to have a united front but still have these very big differences behind the scenes.
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that even though there is this slightly mixed message, we want peace. We don't want people to be criminalized and killed and hurt or imprisoned for their beliefs. But at the same time, we don't fully recognize them as able to have the same rights as some other groups. That this is just another sign of the church evolving slowly in order to become much more progressive. Of course, it might sound a little bit disingenuous at times. It might sound like it's just paying lip service to a specific subject in order to get a broader message across. But as we've seen, the evolution of the church, although moving very slowly, is something that is happening steadily over time. And maybe this is just one of those breadcrumbs on the path to more meaningful change at some point in the future.
I mean, I suppose the big change in a way is that they're being asked these questions at all, Mariana. I mean, in my lifetime, I can't imagine Pope John Paul II, for example, being asked a question about gay rights. Never mind, should there be LGBT marriages within the Catholic Church?
That is a very good point. And also to build on Rory's hope, maybe to solidify it a little bit, Pope Francis has launched what they call a period of global reflection on the church's agenda. This was launched in December 2019, and it's meant to finish or to be concluded in 2024. It's known as a synodal path, and it's really a sign of how progressive Pope Francis is, in that the whole idea of the reflection is to open the church to the world, and especially to the LGBTQ communities. Actually, ironically or not, he's gotten a lot more backlash from women who still see lots of barriers in reaching leadership in the roles of church. So there's lots of questions for the church or for the Vatican to be taking on board. And it's also worth remembering that the Vatican is the head of the largest and most centralized religious organization in the world, in the sense that there's so many clogs in the machine that to actually effect some change, like you were saying, it's very much like a breadcrumb moment type thing.
And still have a role, I guess, finally on this, Mariana, in bringing our attention. I mean, this visit of Christian leaders did pull focus on South Sudan, which is a country that a lot of people, frankly, had forgotten about. Absolutely.
And it's this idea that there's been a sort of like a peace agreement and it's been settled, and there's actually quite a lot of violence and sporadic outbursts throughout the country, which just show that instability is still rife. And also for this visit, visit to Africa, Pope Francis chose the Democratic Republic of the Congo and South Sudan, because he's been very much keen to point out countries that have suffered the most with the legacies of colonialism and have up until now had the most instability because of their past. So he's very much vocal in trying to bring a lot more voices and a lot more perspectives from around the world.
Yeah. Okay, so Chandrika, you're up next after this. Okay, so Chandrika, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the podcast boom over?
New podcast shows are actually down, okay? From 2020 to 2022, it actually went down 80%. So there's not as much of new podcasts that are coming out. Also, new podcast episodes itself are dropping, meaning those people who did create podcasts before are no longer making them.
Podcasters Nikki and Moose discussing podcasting. And now we've played a clip of their podcast talking about podcasts on our news podcast so that we can discuss some podcast news. Suchandrika, what news have you got for our podcast?
It's about podcasts. Yay.
Yeah. Got that.
So apparently new shows are down 80% over the last 2 years, which is a huge drop, right? It makes you think a podcast over. So looking at Charter, so it's CHRTR, these are the analysts, they uncovered this dramatic drop using international data supplied by the podcast engine Listen Notes, which is a very useful way of finding podcasts. So in 2020, 1.1 million podcasts were launched. So that was kind of peak lockdown. People didn't have enough stuff to do. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Those of us who are lucky to have microchips, we put them to good use and we made podcasts. I'm going to link all the stories in. And then in 2021, about 729,000 new titles came out. So there was a drop even from then. You can understand why people are getting back to their jobs, getting back to sort of life after lockdown. And then last year, only 219,000 podcasts debuted, which is a massive drop.
Only 219,000 new podcasts.
I mean, we were on most of them, the four of us. So,
I mean, so what? I mean, I get the trend. The trend's going down, but it, like I say, sort of preposterous level of interest in podcasts during lockdown wasn't there. Wasn't that the blip? Podcasts are still here. They've been here for a long time. Why is this important?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Ollie, for you, like, this is a later wave of podcasting, whereas for like, it became mainstream maybe in the last sort of 5 years, but like you've been podcasting since 2000 and something.
I believe it was 1970 I started, yeah.
So there've been earlier waves, but we weren't discussing them in the same way. But, you know, podcasting did start back in the 2000s and that was really the first wave. But why this is important is for context, there's about 3 million podcasts which are sort of currently running. So, you know, these are big numbers. But it does mean that there's this kind of whole ecosystem and economy around podcasts, and they can make people money, and there are companies that have sprung up to make podcasts. So are we giving up on new talent coming in? Because for a lot of people, this meant they could get around the gatekeepers of kind of radio and other bits of the media. Does that all end now, or are these numbers not the whole story?
Well, I mean, that's certainly the case with regard to my own history in podcasting, Rory, that I got into podcasting because it was an opportunity to make a show that didn't involve talking to a commissioner somewhere and grow a fan base and grassroots and all of that. It is much harder to do that now, isn't it? They call it the discovery problem. If you're a small show and you're not part of a network, you know, you're not on a big media brand, you haven't got a celebrity on it, how do people find you?
With great difficulty, I think is the short answer. I mean, 1 million podcasts a year is an obscene amount of new podcasts popping up. But what these people are finding once they do pop up with a new podcast is that it's hard to get money out of it. So there are very few ways to make money out of a podcast. You can beg your listeners. You can ask for a sponsorship. You can join an advertising network. You can syndicate your show to YouTube, sell merchandise. You can do a bit of public speaking. But as a new podcaster, most of those avenues to making cash are kind of closed off because it's that chicken and egg thing. You know, once you started the podcast, but no one's listening because there's a million other podcasts out there trying to do exactly the same thing. And I do think that a lot of it was pretty much a fad during the COVID years, shall we say, where people tried to do something new with their time and tried to explore their creativity. But once they found out how difficult it was to actually, you know, give up their time for any remuneration, they realized actually, no, this is probably not as easy as I thought. And also it doesn't, like YouTube, have that built-in method of automatically gaining revenue. So when you make a YouTube channel, you know, YouTube will put ads against it and you'll make cash that way. There's not a similar thing in the podcast world. So it's easy to get sucked in and spat out the other side.
There's also an authenticity problem as well, I think, Mariana. I say problem, I mean, it's good for those of us that people believe are being truthful. But if you're cynically getting into podcasting because you're just trying to milk a cash cow, people need to believe that you're a person they can relate to, they want to spend time with you, you're in their ears. Whereas on some of these other mediums, I mean, visual mediums, TikTok, YouTube, half as much of that is about what you look like. People will make a decision on whether they want to spend time on you based on what you look like, not what you're saying. So you can see that for those people, maybe they're in the wrong medium trying podcasting.
I think that's very, very interesting. Like thinking back on my experience trying to find a podcast, I've really been struggling to find new things to listen to because there are so many out there.
But we'll have a chat after this, Mariana. I've got some ideas.
Thank you. Thank you. My dog walks will forever be grateful. But I find that it's exactly that. It's so much more to do with your skill as a presenter, as a host, as an effective communicator, which just relies on your voice and the way that you engage. And I find I've become really biased in the podcast that I do listen tend to be people with a lot of, and even though I like very niche topics, it tend to be very niche topics hosted by people with a lot of media experience. Once again, bringing back a bit of the gatekeeping. But the other side of it is that on the question of authenticity, I was looking a bit into the numbers, and the big drop is mostly on low quality shows, like shows that only have one episode out, which might actually be a good thing for the industry, because it means that the people that were trying out podcasts during COVID created 1 or 2 episodes and sort of moved on, and they've had their go, which is a sign of how the platform or the format has become democratized. But at the same time, in short, is not necessarily just that the number of new shows. So it's more that the new shows have declined, but the numbers don't even take into account Spotify's new podcasts, which is also a very big thing.
Yes. I mean, Spotify put in an enormous investment, didn't they, Suchandrika, into podcasting over the last few years. And then this year have said in their revenue reports, so we might have been a little trigger happy. We might have been a bit enthusiastic in our backing of some of those shows. Is the industry that's built up around podcasting a bit of a bubble as well? There's obviously something to it. There's millions of listeners. But was it built on promises that it can't deliver?
Well, I think it was certainly built on the promise that podcast listening would go up exponentially, and that there's an audience out there that's untapped, that will be like dying to listen to podcasts. And actually, according to Edison Research, which is like, they have a big report every year on podcasts, and they have all the numbers. They say the number of the people in the US who said they listened to a podcast in the last month was 38% last year, which is down from 41% in 2021. So again, it's about those lifestyle changes coming out of the pandemic, I personally think. I will also say that the numbers, which Mariana's sort of talked about, they might kind of not be telling us the whole truth. So I read the Pod News newsletter by James Cridland, and he's taken a look at these numbers and at this phenomenon. And he said that it's worth looking at Anchor, which is a podcast host which hosts for free. So it's really attractive to new podcasters. And they've changed how they submit new shows to Apple Podcasts. So Apple Podcasts is like the kind of classic directory of podcasts. You want your podcast to be registered there. It means people can find it. What usually happens when you start a new podcast is your host sends, can I say podcast as many times as possible, out to all these directories. Can I get sponsored for this, guys? So what Anchor's stopped doing is automatically submitting all new shows to Apple Podcasts, which means that people are still making shows, but they're not registering. So actually the numbers might be telling us the full truth. It doesn't mean that people have necessarily given up, but it does mean they're not being itemized and they're not as discoverable as they have been until recently.
There still seems to be an enormous opportunity for niche podcasts, though, Rory. I don't know if you'd include motoring as niche, but it's that kind of thing, isn't it? Where you can take a subject that possibly doesn't feel like a thing that would be on commercial radio, but is a thing that has a massive audience that might be interested in it. Podcasts are perfect for that.
They really are. I mean, the problem is, as Mariana said earlier, though, there's a lot of people with good ideas, but probably very poor communication skills, who are able to put a podcast together, but not in a compelling way that makes the audience think they haven't wasted 20, 30 minutes of their time listening to one episode and then not tuning in to the next episode.
Do you know, I use podcasts quite a lot for research. So like when we're doing an episode of Today in History with the retrospectors, I'll often listen to what other shows have done on the same topic. And I was listening to one the other day where literally the co-presenter was yawning during the show. And I was like, I mean, we've all done it. But I mean, cut it out of the edit. Don't leave your yawn in.
It's crazy.
That is basic, right? But I think it comes back to what I was saying about the authenticity thing. I think there's an element where people feel like it should be natural, it should be unedited. But actually having a conversation that feels natural and unedited usually takes editing and planning.
Absolutely. And we touched earlier on about how YouTube is an alternative to podcasts. You can have a tab in the background playing. And that's what I do. I use YouTube as my podcast platform. I listen to a lot of aviation related channels, and it operates in exactly the same way as a podcast. You learn about the topic, but invariably the people hosting it put a lot more effort into the production side of things because they're aware that it's a visual platform and people are going to see you when you yawn. So I think there's definitely more pressure to get it right and to have it looking and sounding really good on YouTube, as opposed to a newbie, a beginner on a podcast thinking, well, anyone can do this, I'm not going to make the effort.
Yeah, well, I have just made a cardinal sin of mentioning yawning. Sorry, there's lots of people that are now going to be infectiously yawning as they walk down the streets. Mariana, you said that you'd struggled for a while to find a podcast you were interested in. I feel like I should ask what you came up with. What is your favourite podcast?
This is very niche because I'm a history geek.
Good.
But I was very into, which is not history. So I was very into the podcast of one's own with Julie Gillard, which is about women's experiences in different fields or different fields. They're professional and personal experiences. And she tended to have very charismatic speakers on. So it was very engaging. And that sort of stopped. So my heart was broken a little. And I've been looking for podcasts that are a bit more historical. And I just came across Empire, which is just called Empire, with William Dalrymple and Anita Anand. And it's not just that they have guests, but sometimes they don't have guests. And I think what really helps is, first, they're very charismatic. And second, they're so knowledgeable about their topic, and they can sort of go on off one another. And it's so interactive. It's made me, I usually, for reference, I walk my dog half an hour. The other day, the podcast is 15 minutes. I got home 51 minutes later. My dog was exhausted after all of this.
It's not a puppy, right? It's got long enough legs.
No, it's a 10-year-old dog who just wants to retire and walk half an hour.
As a result of you enjoying a podcast. So, Suchandrika, what's your favourite podcast? Come on, let's do this.
I've got Empire lined up, but I've not listened to it yet.
It's so good.
Yes, I need to get onto it.
Honestly, what's the one you listen to every week? It doesn't have to be a cool, sexy one. It can be Desert Island Discs. Just be honest. What's the one you listen to?
I like Off Menu. That's fine. I like comedy ones.
Okay.
Off Menu. Beef and Dairy when it comes out every month. That's always good.
And Rory?
I mean, I've got a few, The Modern Man, Answer Me This, The Week Unwrapped. I find myself listening to, there's one called The Brilliant Idiots, which is an American comedian and his co-host, an American radio host, discussing topics that they have no expertise in, but doing it in a very, very funny way. There's one called Ear Hustle, which is about life in San Quentin in the prison, which is brilliant because you hear the stories of all these prisoners. But yeah, anything with Olly Mann in it, it'll do me, mate.
Yeah, but it's my favourite too. I do often find myself recommending a show called Hidden Mickeys, but to such an extent that when they only broadcast infrequently, and when I last tuned into an episode, the first 5 minutes was thanking me for mentioning them in places. I was like, I've got to stop doing that. My thanks to Suchandrika, Mariana, and Rory. You can follow this podcast for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped, wherever you get your podcasts, because you still listen to podcasts and you like them, and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with the trial subscription. Just go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, and you cannot make a good podcast without a producer, is Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye.